Are you a mother, father, or you are involved in caring for children? If yes, then listen to Ask the Pediatricians every Thursday by 10 a.m. for insightful discussion on popular child health topics such as dangerous child health practices, immunization, infant feeding, developmental milestones, and so much more. You also get to ask questions on these topics and listen to answers to real-life child health issues by a pediatrician. Ask the Pediatricians Foundation is devoted to health education and information of parents and caregivers of children in the community to support you in raising healthy children. Don't miss Ask the Pediatricians with Dr. Bami because it's informative, educative, and interactive. Ask the Pediatricians Hour, the program for caring parents.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ask the Pediatrician Hour on whichever platform you are listening to me. Some of you are listening and watching on Ask the Pediatricians Foundation Facebook page or our YouTube channel, or you're listening to me on the podcast. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And for those who are watching on YouTube channel, or whether you're listening to us on Fresh Waves Radio, I want to say thank you so much for tuning in today for this brand new episode of Atp Hour. Atp Hour, or Ask the Pediatrician Hour, is brought to you by Ask the Pediatricians Foundation. Ask the Pediatricians Foundation is an organization, non-profit organization that is committed to the health and welfare of all children globally, especially in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa, where majority of our children still die from preventable causes of death. And what we do is to help educate parents about how to keep our children healthy. And we also do community outreaches as well. So ATP Hour is one of our platforms for educating parents about important issues as regards the health of our children. So I really want to say thank you. And you do us a favor by also sharing this video or this podcast, inviting family and friends to join us. And if you have any questions, feel free to post your question to our Ask the Pediatricians Facebook group. From Mondays to Saturdays, we're there. The difference between our groups and many other platforms on social media is that you can be sure that on Ask the Pediatrician, you are getting answers that you would have gotten from your pediatrician in the hospital. So it's something that you can bank on, and that is what we do. So feel free to post your questions on our Facebook group, and you can also email us at askthepediatricians@gmail.com, or you can email me at drwimisala@askthepediatricians.com. Of course, you can also go to our website and read more about some of these topics. Very useful. Many of you, thank you so much. We do get your feedback. You have found the site very useful in giving you important, reliable, evidence-based information. So thank you so much for joining us today. And so like I said, today I'm going to be talking about another important topic that has to do with the health of our children. And today I'm going to be talking about meningitis. Yes, we're going to talk about meningitis. For those of you who are watching, you could have seen the background flyer that today we're talking about meningitis. What is meningitis? What does it mean? How does it happen? Why do we need to talk about meningitis? Why is it so important? How is it possible to prevent it? If a child has it, how do we detect it? How do we treat it? And how do we, more importantly, prevent it? Which is something we always emphasize on Ask the Pediatrician Foundation. It is about prevention. Is always and always better than cure. So thank you so much for joining me today. So let's just go straight in and talk about what is meningitis. When we talk about meningitis, the word meninges will come to mind. And when we say meninges just simply means the covering of the human brain. So our brains are enclosed inside the the skull, and what covers that brain includes what we call the meninges. There are about 3 of them. And in between the first 2, we also have what we call the cerebrospinal fluid, like a water that surrounds the brain area, especially. So this meninges and the water, the cerebrospinal fluid, they provide some protection for the brain. And if you ask me, I think the brain is the most important organ in the body. I know some people say it's the heart. Okay, the heart keeps you alive, but it is the brain that determines what you do really in terms of how well you can live your life. So these meninges, they cover not only the brain, but they also cover the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord together with sometimes we call them the central nervous system. Okay, so if there's any infection affecting these meninges, and that is what we call meningitis, and some people also call it cerebrospinal, meningitis. So just to say, it's not just only the brain, but it can also extend to affect the spinal cord. So any infection leading to inflammation of the this meninges, the covering of the brain, is what is known as meningitis. It's a very, very serious infection, because when we talk about the brain, very important organ. So any infection that gets to the brain is very serious. It is very, very serious. It's something that can be life threatening. It's something that can lead to death. And so it is so important for us to know about it. It is a very important disease of what we call public health significance, okay? And the germs or the pathogens, as we call them, that can affect this brain covering or the meninges, there are many of them. And we include the viruses. We have different kind of germs. We have the viruses. We also have the bacteria. We also have even fungal, and other not so common pathogens. Any of them, somehow they can find their way into the brain and affect these meninges and cause this condition we know as meningitis. There are especially the bacterial one. We have some when it comes to children, and I'm talking about children below the age of 5. There are 3 specific bacteria that tends to cause meningitis. We have Streptococcus pneumoniae. Don't worry about the big jargon, so you can call it pneumococcal bacteria. We also have the Haemophilus influenzae type B, Haemophilus bacteria, and we also have what we call the Neisseria meningitidis. Well, you can call it meningococcal bacteria. So these 3, between the 3 of them, they tend to cause the largest cases of meningitis. And what is even more serious about them is that the N meningitis, the meningococcal one, can actually cause what we call epidemics. In other words, it's something that can affect several people at the same time. And it's really those who live in the northern parts of Africa, Nigeria, we have what we call the meningitis belts, and those areas, they are prone to having this outbreak or these epidemics of meningitis. So that epidemic tends to be caused by the bacteria called meningococcal bacteria. But the good news is that for those 3 serious pathogens, in the bacterial ones, we have vaccines against them. All right, but there are other bacteria as well that can cause meningitis that we don't have vaccines against, and there are also viruses, and there are other organisms as well that can cause meningitis. And meningitis is something that can affect any age group. It can affect any age group. It can affect newborn babies. It can affect preschool children under 5. It can even affect young adults. It can affect adults as well. So, and like I said, it can happen like affecting one person at a time, what we call sporadic cases, or it can happen as epidemics in which it affects multiple people at a time. And like I said, people that live in the meningitis area, which is part of the sub-Saharan Africa, from Senegal to Ethiopia, which cuts across some northern parts of Nigeria as well, they are prone to having serious epidemics of meningitis. So that's why it's so important for us to know about meningitis and know how to manage it, to be talking about today. So the issue is, how does this pathogens, how do they get to the brain? Because you can see that the brain is really covered in the brain is well protected, and so for something to get to the brain, it's actually quite difficult, but it is still possible, for these germs to get into the brain. And most of the time, these bacteria, they first start from the nose of the throat, like the strep pneumonia. Most people that have it will have sore throats, and cough and sputter, all look like respiratory infections, but it can now get into the blood, and from there it can spread into the brain, because some of these germs are really very virulent. They are very horrible, and so it is. And most time it can be carried from one person to another person, and so somehow they get into the blood, especially if there is not enough immunity to fight them off, and such people will now end up having meningitis. And especially if it is there are risk factors for meningitis. So people who have low immunity, and people who live in crowded places where there are so many people living together, they can always get themselves introduced to these germs easily. And of course, children under the age of 5, they are just more susceptible to these germs, and that is how sometimes they do have meningitis. So one way or the other, the germs gets to the meninges and causes this inflammation and causes this disease we know as meningitis. And I think what is more important for parents is, how do I know if my child has meningitis? Just like most other infections, and I think I did talk about sepsis not quite long ago. Sometimes in children, especially the newborn babies, they are not often very much in your face kind of symptoms. So, and that is why we don't joke around infections or illnesses in newborns, and especially the first 2 months of life. Sometimes it may just be as simple as them having fever, or not even fever. They may be having low body temperature, what we call hypothermia. So the child can have just fever, or the child may have low body temperature, or the child may just be not having, not looking right, like they are just not themselves. They are not sucking. That is for the newborn babies. They may just stop sucking. And sometimes when parents ask me this question, and my child is not sucking, and you got to go to the hospital now, some of them will not sucking. How is that serious? Can be very serious, because it could be one of the signs of meningitis in the newborn babies. So it could just be as simple as that. So that is why if a newborn baby is sick at all, you have to take them to the hospital. And sometimes when they have sepsis, which is the germs circulating in their blood, it can also get into the brain, because their own brain, the covering of the brain, and what we call the blood-brain barrier, is not fully matured in them, and so it's easy for germs in the newborn babies to get straight into into the brain and cause meningitis, and which is a very, very serious infection. However, for the older children, toddlers, preschoolers, the symptom may be more obvious. So you can start having things like fever. Is always one of the most common features in meningitis, just like any other infection. But in addition, other symptoms that are more specific, to meningitis include things like convulsions. So if a child is having fever and having convulsions, sometimes it could just be what we call febrile convulsion, which we have talked about before, but sometimes it may be the first sign of meningitis. Also, children may complain of neck pain, especially for children who can talk. They will start telling you they have neck pain, or their neck becomes very stiff, so they can't turn their neck easily. If a child is complaining of fever, neck stiffness, or they can't turn their neck easily, or they're having neck pain or headaches, because sometimes children don't always have the right words to describe some of these things, so they use their own terminology. So, but those are very serious symptoms that will make us as professionals to think about meningitis. So, fever, convulsion, neck pain. Some children may also complain of what we call photophobia. In other words, they don't want to look at the sun. They will tell you, oh, I don't want to look at the sun, or it's making me feel somehow, that kind of a thing. So if you see your child complaining of such symptoms, then it may be a sign of meningitis. Or sometimes some children become unconscious, or they fall have what we call altered mental status. They're either drowsy, or they are having delirium, confusion. They start talking out of turn and things like that. Again, this will worry us. So some children can complain of headaches. For the older children, they tend to complain of headaches. They can also complain of fever, of vomiting. When you start seeing this sign, these are the early signs: the fever, the convulsion, the vomiting, the nausea, the neck pain, the fact that they don't want to look into the sun. Those are photophobia. But by the time the meningitis is becoming more serious, then the children may become unconscious, or you start seeing that maybe they can't see, vision loss or hearing loss, so they can, become weak, all those things. So, by that time, it's really very serious. Most of the time, the children are in the hospital at that time. So, if your child has fever, which is one thing I really want to emphasize today, because most of our mothers, when our children have fever, and really those of us who live in Nigeria, we tend to always assume everything is malaria. Or now some of us, even when we go to some of these our private hospitals, the next thing they say is either malaria or typhoid, or malaria typhoid, like they call it together. And I always try to tell people it's very, very unusual for you to have malaria and typhoid at the same time. But if your child has fever, please avoid just assuming malaria. Avoid just always just jumping to malaria treatment. Some of the children have meningitis, and I had a very bad experience with one of our volunteers recently whose child actually had meningitis. But initially, the mother herself and maybe the very first set of hospitals, they were just treating the child for malaria, treating malaria. So we need to start knowing that there are other things beyond malaria that can make a child to have fever. Actually, when we start seeing all those other symptoms I've mentioned about, we start seeing headaches, neck pain, the child is becoming unconscious or delirious or confused. Please take those children to the hospital, because some of them may have meningitis. And for our health professionals, please, let's always think beyond malaria in children, especially when they're having some of these other symptoms. Let's make effort to always test children. Let's make effort to do blood tests, and sometimes examine them, because sometimes when we examine children, there are signs that doctors we can see. So sometimes we notice what we call that the child has neck stiffness. They can't use their chin to touch their chest and all that. Or we notice that, there are some signs, doctors know what I'm talking about, like panic sign and all that we look for. So we have to think beyond malaria. Most children, in my experience, that die from meningitis in Nigeria and Africa is because many of the time the professionals, the parents, the professionals were just so focused on malaria, and they mixed these early signs of meningitis. And like I said, meningitis is a very devastating illness. So if you don't treat it on time, it can be very, very horrible. And so that is why we need to pick it up. So if your child have the symptoms of meningitis, what do? You have to go to the hospital. So there are some conditions we cannot do home management. There are some I know mothers, we have what do we call it? I always call us as the first line doctors for the home. So children are sick, they come to their mother, and we start to do our little first aid, which is fine. Child is having fever, you give them paracetamol. They're having headaches, you give them paracetamol. But once they're not getting better within 24 hours, the fever is still very high, or they are beginning to give you signs other symptoms of what we've already mentioned about the neck pain, the neck stiffness, the photophobia. Some may also have rashes. It's not very easy to see it in those of us who are African, but for uh, those who are Caucasian, they can also see some kind of rash that we see in those who are having the meningococcal kind of meningitis. So they can also say that. So once we see all those symptoms, please don't keep on treating malaria. Some people say I'm treating malaria 2 times, 3 times. It's very unnecessary. Okay, most time there's something else going on. So please take those children to the hospital. Preferably take them to a hospital that have a pediatrician, especially for under 5, because it's not every doctor. Some doctors are not very good in picking up some of these things as well. So it's important to take them to government hospitals or hospital that is secondary level, tertiary level, not health center. There are some things health centers cannot do. They can't manage meningitis. That is the honest truth. So you need to be in a hospital where you can see a proper doctor, a proper pediatrician who can examine the child and confirm or suspect that they have meningitis and do the needful tests. So there are tests we do. Usually we do what we call lumbar puncture tests, where we take water, that water I mentioned earlier, the cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds the brain. We can take that water from your child's back and then we'll send it to the lab. And that can help us to know if there's infection. If there's infection, meningitis, there are certain changes that will happen in that water. The number of white blood cells in that water will increase. It may even look cloudy. Then we can see what we call the protein. There are some certain tests we can check on it. We can even send it for culture and they will tell us which particular germ or pathogen is causing that infection. Of course, we'll do the usual blood tests. We'll still check for the malaria. We'll do all those other things. We'll check the child's blood pressure, because if the child is already having the complication of the meningitis, there are other things that we can see in the, from our physical examination of the child. And when we see that, then we can now, know. So whether, because if the child, for example, if you have what we call high raised intracranial pressure, we will not even want to take blood, because if not, the brain is going to sink into the into the neck area, and the child can die from that complication. So, but your doctor will know what to do depending, because an emergency, if a child is having meningitis, is a very serious and illness, and it's an emergency, and it's an hospital-based treatment. Okay, somebody was asking me a question, say, oh, what are the people ask a lot of questions about a child who is very ill, and they're asking about home remedies. What are the home remedies? People always ask for home remedies for illnesses, and I was very blunt and say that this is not an home remedy thing. It is not everything that has home remedy. Some things are purely hospital-based treatment. Meningitis is one of them. You can even treat your malaria at home. Your child can take oral drugs. Meningitis, the treatment is giving antibiotics if it is caused by bacteria. Of course, if it is caused by virus, depending, we can give antiviral agents. Some of them we don't have any specific treatment. If it is caused by fungal, we can give the antifungal drugs. But most of these drugs have to be given into the veins. And when we suspect a child has meningitis, we don't wait. We don't wait until we see the result before we start treating them. So in other words, if a child comes to the hospital and we're thinking meningitis, we start treating that child immediately, because that's the earlier the treatment, the better. If we are very slack and we delay, even an hour can make a difference between life and death. So if a child comes to us and we're seeing signs of meningitis, of course, we rush to take all our blood samples, the CSF fluid if we can take it, and then we'll start treatment covering all the common pathogens. So we cover the bacteria, cover the virus, cover fungi, we cover everything at once. We even cover severe malaria as well, because sometimes they may look alike and we are not sure at the beginning. So we start treating them like that. Then when we get our result back, we can decide, okay, we are sure this is the streptococcal, pneumococcal bacteria, or it is meningococcal bacteria. We are sure of a particular pathogen. Then we can take off what is not necessary and continue with what is necessary. And that is how we treat meningitis. And treatment for meningitis can be long. Some of them can be up to 2 weeks. Some can be up to 6 weeks. Yeah. If your child has what we call some kind of meningitis. Sometimes we have to treat for 6 weeks. Sometimes tuberculosis is another thing that can also cause meningitis. The tuberculosis that cause cough and pneumonia, it can also actually get to the brain and cause meningitis as well. So we also have to treat some, if it is what we call the gram-negative bacteria. Sometimes we treat the children for 21 days on antibiotics, so they are in the hospital. It's really for the newborns. Older children, sometimes some of them as early as 7 to 14 days, depending on what germ we're dealing with. That will determine the duration of treatment. The reason why I'm saying this is that, so when your doctor tells you are going to be in the hospital for 3 weeks, please don't fight it. When we talk about the brain is a very important organ, and anything getting to that brain has to be addressed. And I've talked to us about special needs children before, and one of the things that could make a child to develop disability or to have special needs is meningitis. So we are very aggressive in clearing the bacteria or the germs or whatever pathogen is causing the meningitis. We have to clear it completely. So we often keep your child in the hospital for as long as necessary. So it is not one of those treatments that you start and say, oh, I'm tired, I'm going, I want to leave. No, you have to stay in the hospital for as long as necessary, and see the doctor release you to go, so that your child, because it's not even just giving the antibiotics, there are also what we call supportive management. Sometimes some of the children are unconscious. Some of them we have to put drip for them, to feed them through the drip until they wake up. Sometimes some of them, their brain is swelling. If the brain is already swollen, cerebral edema, we have to give something to reduce the brain back to the normal size. So there are many things we need to do. So it is a very serious illness, and we have to deal with it thoroughly, and hopefully we win and the child can go home. Because unfortunately, sometimes, especially for children that they don't pick it up early, we can still lose those children. That is the honest truth. We can lose the children, but we hope that if we pick it up on time, we will not lose the children, and we can treat it, and the children can go home. And even sometimes when we have won the battle, in other words, the child is alive, but sometimes we still have to continue with the war of the long-term complications of meningitis, because this is the brain we're talking about. So there are many complications that can come with meningitis. There are complications that can happen in what we call acute, shortly after the child has been admitted, and there are complications that can happen in future, even after the child has been discharged. We call them long-term complications. So there are short-term complications and there are long-term complications. What are the short-term complications? Sometimes the children can have, they can become unconscious. They can have swelling of the brain, what we call cerebral edema. The brain is swollen, the child is unconscious. It's one of the early complications that we may have to do with. The pressure in the brain, just like you have blood pressure, that's what we call intracranial pressure. So the pressure can go up. And when that is up, it can compress the brain. And when it compresses the brain, it can affect some parts of the brain that controls some essential things. Like I told you, I think the brain is the most important organ, because there are parts of the brain that control your breathing. There are parts of the brain that control how your heart is beating and all that. So sometimes when the pressure is too high, it can affect those parts of the brain, especially that controls the breathing, and the child's breathing can slow down, and the child's blood heart rate can slow down, and sometimes we can lose the child in that process. Or the child can cone, what we call it coning and all that. Don't worry about the medical jargons, but basically the effect on the brain can lead to death of that child. Sometimes when children will have convulsions, and they have convulsions over and over, that we have to struggle to control that conversion. We have what we call status epilepticus. These are early things that can happen. Sometimes the bacteria, the germ can form pus inside the brain, what we call cerebral abscess. So there's pus formed in the brain. That is a problem, because we need to do brain surgery. We need to bring out that pus. So sometimes we need to get the neurosurgeons to be part of our management, so that they can remove the pus from the brain, and so that the child can get better. And that can also cause severe damage to the brain itself, because that part of the brain where the pulse is and it's removed, it can be a problem. And this pulse can also be inside the CSF as well, and it can spread around. So these are early complications that doctors have to deal with. There are other ones which I won't even want to talk about, but there are things that we have to deal with. But there are other long-term complications, which is even the one that tends to worry us. So because any injury to the brain can cause long-term complications. So meningitis, though it's just the covering of the brain, the infection can spread from the covering to the brain itself, leading to what I call about, if we can have infection of the brain matter itself, what we call encephalitis, the brain itself, or we can also have the pulse in the brain. But later on, it can also lead to damages in the brain that we cannot see with our eyes. So later on, those children can have what we call epilepsy. So some children start to have convulsion without fever. When they have meningitis, is fever with a convulsion. But later on, they can have epilepsy, which is convulsions without fever. And we have to put them on drugs for that. And some children who have epilepsy, the cause of the epilepsy is the fact that they had meningitis when they were younger. Okay, you can also have what we call cerebral palsy. So cerebral palsy is a disorder. There is a group of disorder really, but basically children who have cerebral palsy struggles with their developmental milestones in terms of movement and posture. So they may be slow walking, slow. Some of them may even be confined to wheelchair. Some may not have. So most of the signs that a child is able to do certain things before, then they stop doing those things. So the child was walking, running, climbing, and all that. Then after the meningitis, the child kind of go back. The child goes back to losing all those milestones. They can't crawl, they can't sit, they can't have their neck control. Then we start having to deal with that. Sometimes some of them gradually will recover some of those milestones. Some may never recover all. So they may develop what we call cerebral palsy. Again, this is a long-term complication. Some children may have what we call intellectual disability. So this is a child who is already talking, who is doing well in school, have meningitis with all the complications, and the child may stop talking. The child have what we call difficulties with their cognitive ability, with their learning ability. So intellectual disability is also one of the long-term complications of meningitis. So you can see why it's so important for us to pick up meningitis early. Sometimes if we are very aggressive and we pick it up early and we treat it on time, we may be able to overcome. And some of our children do escape all these complications. But unfortunately, some of them will have these complications for a long time, and they will have the longer term complications like the epilepsy, like the cerebral palsy, like the intellectual disability, and so on and so forth. Some will have blindness, some will have hearing loss, so that's why we check for all these things. Even after we discharge your child from meningitis, we'll follow them up. We have to follow them up because we need to monitor whether the child will develop blindness, whether the child is developing hearing loss. Sometimes they develop blindness, what we call cortical blindness, but they tend to recover over time. But some hearing loss, actually Haemophilus influenza is associated with hearing loss and strep as well. Some will develop the cerebral palsy, the epilepsy, and we have to treat that. And of course, some will have other intellectual disability, and they will need rehabilitation and support around that. It can be quite devastating for parents, especially who have had a child developing normally and now have meningitis, and then the child, kind of regress, lose all their skills, and it's as if we're starting over again. It can be quite devastating. Now, it seems like it's a grim picture I have painted about meningitis, but I think it's just for us to know how serious and how important this disease is, and how we need to make sure we avoid it and prevent it. So I'm going to end up by talking about, it's is meningitis preventable? And the good answer is yes, 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 yes. We can definitely prevent meningitis. And like I said at the earlier part of the broadcast, there are three main culprits when it comes to the bacterial meningitis in children, especially under 5 children. There are three main culprits, bacterial pathogens, and luckily for us, we have vaccine. So immunization is very important when it comes to meningitis. Many of the vaccines we give to our children actually protects them against meningitis, which is why it's so important. Please, mothers, let's not be forgetting our immunization dates. So the other day I posted about immunization, and somebody was telling me, "Oh, Dr. Gumi, make sure you post this again closer to the time." And I'm like, "Serious? Is this your responsibility to make sure you remember? Put it in your reminder, put it in your phone. You should remember. These days we have lots of technology to remind us. Please don't miss your children's immunization, because this is one of the reasons why we give our children immunization, so that they won't have meningitis. So starting from BCG. So the BCG we give at birth will protect our children from tuberculosis. And one of the good things about BCG is that it protects against the severe form of tuberculosis, one of which is tuberculous meningitis. So please make sure you take BCG for your children. It will protect them against tuberculous meningitis, number one. Number two, we have the pneumococcal vaccine. We have the PCV13, PCV10, different brands, because some of these bacteria, which is one of the challenges we have with them, they are different strains or types of them. So, and each of those types can also cause meningitis. So sometimes when we're developing vaccines, we can't even cover all the possible strains or types of these bacteria pathogens. So what we normally do is to cover the very serious ones. And so we have the pneumococcal vaccine, which is given at 6 weeks, 10 weeks, and 14 weeks. It will protect your children under 5 against pneumococcal meningitis, also pneumococcal pneumonia, and the rest of any infections caused by the pneumococcal bacteria. But please make sure you take that pneumococcal vaccine. When we started ATP, people have to pay for it. We used to call it Prevena then. I think it was about 20,000 naira. But luckily for us, the Nigerian government has made it part of our national program on immunization. I always tell mothers, these immunizations, these vaccines are not cheap. And the fact that you're getting them free, doesn't mean they are free. Somebody is paying for them. So if the government has done their part to pay for these vaccines and bring it to us, the minimum part for us to do is to make sure we take our children to get them. So please, let's not be playing the forgetfulness excuse. You have your immunization card, all those vaccines are listed there. It's your responsibility to make sure that you take your children and let them get those vaccines. So pneumococcal vaccine will protect your children against pneumococcal bacteria form of meningitis. We also have the Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine, which has been incorporated into what we call the Penta vaccine for those in Nigeria. In other places, it's Exa vaccine. They have 6 of them together, but in Nigeria, it's Penta. We're still doing, which is DPT, and the hepatitis B viral vaccine, and the Haemophilus influenza type B. So if you take your children for the Penta at 6, 10, and 14 weeks, your child is protected against Haemophilus influenza type B. And it really seems to be dying out of Nigeria now, thank God, because many of us are taking that vaccine, so we don't tend to have a lot of our children having Haemophilus type of meningitis again. But please, let's make sure we keep taking immunization. We also have the meningococcal vaccine, and there are different types. So, but in Nigeria, in Africa, the type that tends to affect our children is the type A. So please, it's given at 9 months. We give it with the measles and the yellow fever vaccine and the meningococcal vaccine. Again, that used also not to be part of our schedule, but now it is part of our immunization schedule, but it's given at 9 months. So please take those. So if you take those 3 vaccines, in fact, those 4 vaccines, including BCG, the Haemophilus influenza type B, the pneumococcal, and the meningococcal vaccines, you would have protected your children from the most common causes of bacterial meningitis. So please and please, let's ensure. Some of you do ask questions. There are other form of meningococcal vaccine. There are some that protect against other strains like the CW, the Y, the W125. So those are other strains, and we have vaccines. Actually, private hospitals sometimes give you the one that protect against all those strains. If you have the money to pay for that, why not? Please go for it. But if you don't have the money, you don't have excuse, go for the free one given by the government. It protects against Men A. And like I said, Men A is the cause in 70% of our cases. So if you get the Men A, you are more or less protected against the most common type of variants that we do have in Nigeria. So immunization, it is so important. It is so important that we protect our children against meningitis. Another way to protect people, protect us against meningitis, is what we call chemoprophylaxis. So if you have been in contact with somebody who have meningitis, if you are a close family member or you live in the same house, sometimes we give you antibiotics so that you will not have meningitis. So we sometimes want to be on the lookout, even though you're not showing symptoms, but because you've been exposed. Like I said, most of these things are spread through droplets and all that. So we always give what we call chemoprophylaxis. So usually if your doctor has made diagnosis of, of meningitis, then there are drugs that they will give to people who are in close contact of those people. Like even if a mother, for example, has the streptococcal pneumonia in a vaginal flora and the baby was born, sometimes we have to give the baby antibiotics to protect against the baby developing streptococcal infection and meningitis. So those are the things that we can do. And of course, all the general hygiene thing. Let's avoid overcrowding. Let's avoid places where there are too many people living in the same room or crowded places. Lots of mothers always ask me questions, can I take my baby to this place, to that place? One of the reasons why you don't want to be taking your children to crowded places like open market and busy places is because of meningitis, because it's very easy to spread infection. And even though you're taking your immunization, you still have to take other precautions. So avoid overcrowded places. Let's make sure our rooms are well ventilated. Let's open the windows. Please, let's open the windows. Let breeze blow in and out. Let's wash our hands. We're doing a lot of that during the COVID era, but it seems like most of us are beginning to forget all that. Let's wash our hands. Let's avoid unnecessary close contact with people, and let's make sure that we do our best. So, and also the government does a lot of work. The government also monitor outbreaks, and when the government notices that there's an outbreak or there's potential outbreak, then they immunize those of us again. So we also have, apart from the routine immunization, which are the ones I've talked about, we also have what we call supplementary immunization, where the government just immunize everybody. I remember when we go for youth service then, because I served in the north, I served in Sokoto State, which is part of the northern belt, the meningitis belt of Nigeria. They always immunize those of us who are youth corpers when we come in. So they will give all of us the meningitis vaccine, so to protect us. And sometimes when there's an outbreak, everybody, adults, children, they will give us the meningococcal vaccine just to make sure that we are protected and to raise our immunity level because of the outbreak. So if there is if the government is doing that supplementary immunization because they're suspecting an outbreak or there's an ongoing outbreak, please take it. Don't say I've taken before, take again, because we need to booster your immunity and we need to quickly contain the outbreak of meningitis. So those are the ways by which we can avoid and prevent meningitis. Unfortunately, once it has happened, what we call secondary prevention is to make sure that that child gets to the hospital on time and the child is treated. And I think for me, in my experience as a pediatrician in Nigeria, especially, the main challenge we have is late presentation to the hospital. A child is sick, we are not going to the hospital, we are assuming teething, we are assuming malaria or malaria typhoid. Is one I've had bad experience with people I mean, and I'm talking about our people who knows us and who are part of ATP, but we lost their children from meningitis because of these challenges. Either we parents don't go on time, or the hospital sometimes our health professional, they miss meningitis because they are not thinking beyond malaria. Everything is not malaria. It is one of the reasons I always want, when mothers say, oh, my child is having fever, you will never see us say, oh, just go and treat malaria. We don't. We always want you to go to the hospital. And we don't just even have to treat malaria until you've confirmed malaria. The minimum blood test, full blood counts, malaria, will tell us this is malaria. Will tell us whether the white blood cells counts are high, which will be high in meningitis. And if there are all those symptoms, a doctor will pick it up, and we know that this is not just malaria we're dealing with. So this is more than malaria. This is meningitis, and we have to treat it aggressively. So I just want to use this opportunity to remind us that there are other sinister diseases out there beyond malaria. Even though I know we are living in a malaria endemic area and it's one of our worst, most common condition, but there are other conditions, and meningitis is one of them. All right. So thank you so much for listening. If you are just joining me, I've been talking about meningitis. Meningitis is an infection of the coverings, what we call meninges of the brain. It is usually caused by different bacteria, different germs, ranging from viruses to bacteria to fungal and all that. And I've mentioned the common ones, especially in children under the age of 5, the pneumococcal bacteria, the Haemophilus bacteria, and the meningococcal bacteria. And luckily for us, we have vaccines against these 3 group of bacteria. Not all of them, but at least the common players among them. We have the vaccines, and they are available, they are free, they are part of our national program on immunization schedules. So, and if we take these precautions, making sure that we take our children for these vaccines, they are largely protected. I'm not saying they are 100% protected. They are largely protected against these severe cases of meningitis, but you still have to take note of all the precautions, good hygiene, breastfeeding, nutrition, every other thing that we normally talk about on ATP. We still need to do that. Good hand washing, avoiding overcrowded places, good ventilation in the homes. All these things will help us. And if you have no business traveling, don't go to meningitis belts, especially when there's an outbreak. Please stay where you are. All right. And so that's another reason why you don't want to take children on long journeys if you don't have to, or you travel by air, so you don't go through getting them exposed to things like that. So if you do all that, most of our children will be protected. And like I said, if we notice any symptom, fever, headaches, neck stiffness, the child doesn't want to look into the sun, please, or the child is having convulsions, don't do home management, don't assume malaria, don't assume teething. Please take the children through the hospital, let the doctors have a good look at the child, and let them examine the child and treat the child properly. If we treat our children properly, most of them will be fine, and most of them will not have complications. Of course, some children will have complications, including hearing impairment, vision loss, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, long-term complications, which we don't want the children to have. But that boils down to us picking it up early and treating it early. And final word for my colleagues, please, if a child has come to you with fever and convulsions, please, you must rule out meningitis. It is important. You must. We all know that, okay? Actually, for children who are like under 2, please tap the back. Take the CSF, send it to the lab. We don't lose anything doing that. We may save somebody from dying, and we may save a child from long-term complications of meningitis. So let's make effort to always see the children, examine them, do the needful tests, and treat everything. Let's not just always assume malaria in everything. All right, so thank you so much for listening. If you have any question, like I said earlier, feel free to put it on our Facebook group, and we'll try and answer them. Like I said, once in a while, we also have an open day on the ATP Hour, where we can just do Q&A. So any question that you have, we can take them and answer them. But remember that you don't even have to wait till then. You can always go to Ask the Pediatricians Facebook group. You can miss our group on Facebook. It's one of the largest parenting group. Go there, put in your question, and you can even ask your question anonymously. People don't have to know who you are, and you can be sure that the answer you get will be from a professional perspective. All right, so feel free to post the questions to us from Monday to Saturday. You can also put it on our website. You can also send us an email, Dr. Bimisola at askthepediatricians.com, and we will be able to address them correctly. Remember, you can watch all these videos, including the old ones, on this same platform you're watching on Facebook, or you can check out my podcast, Ask Dr. Bimi ATP Podcast. You can listen to, if you're the type that like to listen, and if you're the type that like to watch, you can go to our YouTube channel, ATP TV, and you can watch all the past videos, and feel free to let us know what you think about them. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again next week, when I'll be talking again about another important topic that has to do with the health of our children. In the interim, please, let's keep our children safe from meningitis, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
To real-life child health issues by a pediatrician. Ask the Pediatricians Foundation is devoted to health education and information of parents and caregivers of children in the community to support you in raising healthy children. Don't miss Ask the Pediatricians with Dr. Bimi, because it's informative, educative, and interactive. Ask the Pediatricians Hour, the program for caring parents. Are you a mother, father, or you are involved in caring for children? If yes, then listen to Ask the Pediatricians every Thursday by 10 a.m. for insightful discussion on popular child health topics such as dangerous child health practices, immunization, infant feeding, developmental milestones, and so much more. You also get to ask questions on these topics and listen to answers to real-life child health issues by a pediatrician. Ask the Pediatricians Foundation is devoted to health education and information of parents and caregivers of children in the community to support you in raising healthy children. Don't miss Ask the Pediatricians with Dr. Bimi, because it's informative, educative, and interactive. Ask the Pediatricians Hour, the program for caring parents.